Okay. Hey everybody, welcome back to Bottomless Coffee. Super excited to have you here. I'm actually running low on my cup today, but that's because I was chugging before I started conversing with our guests in our pre-call. Um, we are covering ground that you're already somewhat familiar with today. It's caregiving. You'll remember we talked with Rachel from episode 2. She, at the time, was the sole executive director of Love Labor Project. And then she came back in episode 8 and talked about a merger with an Atlanta based organization called Our Turn to Care. So now the Love Labor Project has two executive directors, and one of those executive directors is here with us today. Hi, Aisha. Aisha Adkins. I should say her name. Hi, Aisha. How are you?
I am doing great, Jerome. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I was really enjoying our pre-recorded conversation, and um, I was trying to hold back and not share too much of my personal experience with caregiving ahead of time because I know we've got so many points of intersection to discuss today. And I really do feel like, and I think a lot of our listeners and viewers are also going to feel as though caregiving is coming up a lot more often in our lives now that we are more aware of it. And so, in a general sense, most recently, I was reading about President Biden's infrastructure bill, and, right alongside roads and bridges and what have you, there's also a provision for caregiving that it turns out you know more about than I do. I guess surprise, surprise, it's caregiving, so that makes sense. Um, but your specific area of expertise vis a vis our turn to care was BIPOC and LGBTQIA and historically marginalized by white supremacist thinking people's um, caregivers, right? Now, was that also millennial caregivers in particular, like Rachel was doing with Love Labor Project before you came?
Yes, most definitely. Early on in my caregiving journey, I really noticed the gaps in
Mm.
information and resources and support for communities that and caregivers who are often, very marginalized in society and historically so, as you mentioned. Um, but particularly as a 27-year-old at the time,
Mm.
I realized that a lot of the information was really a foreign language to me, because I wasn't familiar with Medicare and power of attorney privileges and
Mm.
kind of all of this jargon that uh, you typically are not introduced to until you are much older in age.
Yeah.
So it was new territory for me, but I knew I probably wasn't the only one.
And that really tracks with, what the limited bit that I know about caregiving. It's that everyone needs it. No one really knows a lot about it. And for some reason, I say no one, you know a lot about it. Caregivers know a lot about it. But for some reason, that infrastructure and the legalese behind it, everything is very complicated and it becomes like very difficult for caregivers to do something that is already difficult. Um, just a little bit about my personal experience with caregiving, just to ground it. Uh, Aside from the conversations with Rachel, I've never been a caregiver myself. My grandmother, who lives in Goldsboro, North Carolina, if you're familiar with that area, the mother of my uncle, Mike Evans, that we were just talking about in the pre-recorded part of the call, she is one of 11 siblings, and every time we talk or I visit or what have you, I do hear about who she's taking care of. And as far back as I can remember, and I was going there to Goldsboro as a kid, um, in particular, like my aunt Wanda, she had a salve that she had to rub on her leg, and she had to do all of these tasks. But that was never like the idea of being compensated for it. Was never really part of the conversation. It seemed like something she was just kind of expected to do. Maybe that has to do with the fact that she was a woman. Maybe if she was a younger daughter, I actually don't know where she falls in the line of 11, right? I think it's towards the back. Or that she was either a nurse or a volunteer nurse, which during her time would have been one of the few jobs that a Black woman would have been able to do. So when you say that, you looked around and there wasn't any support for caregivers of color or who had been historically marginalized parts of those communities. That's a huge, obvious gap, and I'm really glad that you stepped up. Can you tell us more about Our Turn to Care and what you do and how it works?
Yeah, most definitely. Um, first of all, I just want to acknowledge that, you know, um, you mentioned that, care is often kind of just something that you do, and it's
Mm-hmm.
sort of an expectation. I think particularly in communities of color, there is more of an idea of family loyalty that is just different from predominantly white communities, and there's actually a sociological theory called familialism,
Hmm.
and it's the expectation uh, that family will provide care for the sick and aging loved ones in their family, and
Yeah.
um, viewing that through a feminist lens, most often that is the eldest daughter. And so you were right on with that. Um,
Hmm.
with Our Turn to Care, I started in 2017 because I really wanted to create space, hold space for culturally relevant content. There are a lot of things that I think people who belong to majority demographics take for granted
Mm-hmm.
in looking for care. So whether it's things like if you hire a paid care worker to come into your home to help assist with your loved one, but uh, your first language is not English, for instance.
Hmm.
Communication is severely affected, or the person that's being receiving the care, their first language is not English, and that definitely has an impact. There are religious considerations to be taken into account when providing care, whether it has to do with modesty or of dress or
Hmm.
different ritual practices or food restrictions. There are so many things that I think that people don't really consider, and even just the dynamics of race, of gender identity. For folks in the LGBTQIA plus community, it can be difficult providing care for maybe a loved one who is not accepting or affirming, of their identity. And so,
Oh
just
yeah.
I've always been one to really fight for the underdogs, and so I certainly, was eager to let young adult caregivers know that there's someone who's rooting for them. Primarily, we began as a resource hub. And there's a lot of information about, what is Medicare, what is Medicaid, how do you navigate those systems.
Good
Um,
information.
yes, yes, and vital information, because
Yes.
these are the avenues that people use to access the services that are in the community.
Mm-hmm.
Biden's American Jobs Plan, one of the key points within that bill is home and community-based services. And that includes things like not only having a paid care worker come into the home, but day programs that provide enrichment for older adults and socialization, home modifications. If there is a change in ability. Someone who is maybe more mobile, and in my mother's case, she's lost a lot of her mobility. So being able to have um, modifications in the home to make it safer and easier for them to navigate the home. And then also, legal services, getting advice on things like estate planning. What do we do when, there are 10 siblings, one is performing most of the care work, and, but, you know, our grandmother doesn't have a will, for instance, and
Yeah.
how are those things, how are her belongings then dispersed? So there are a lot of things that come into play.
So those
And
are
I feel like our communities also don't always have access to um, the educational aspect of it.
yeah.
So that's kind of where we started, and I really also was passionate about holding um, space around support groups. So many of the support groups that I've belonged to, that I've participated in, are predominantly white, predominantly older adults
Hmm.
over the age of 65. And so, the discussion there um, is not about starting your career. It's not about, starting a family or looking for, a partner. These things are often already established. And so just the tone of the conversation is very different. So I wanted to make sure that there was a space to have those kinds of conversations. And at the beginning of the pandemic, found that Rachel was, um, had created a similar space, and we connected and became fast friends.
Oh, that's fantastic. So, in the history of bottomless coffee, I have never had to take notes. But as you were even just really introducing our turn to care to us and the work that you do and the resources, I said, let me grab a pencil and paper because there really is so much to unpack. And when we're talking about caregivers, BIPOC and marginalized millennial caregivers, we're talking about taking care of people who are often significantly older, particularly in that professional setting. And when after interviewing Rachel, was just on Instagram, like hashtag caregiver, going through, and y'all, some of the people who people who look like me or look like a sister I might have or taken care of are terrible human beings, right? They are like they're spitting on people, they're cussing people out. And I had like literally no idea, because I'm like, episode 2, I learned about caregiving. The next week, I'm on Instagram looking at caregiving. And I'm like, what is happening? These people are trying to serve you food. They are bathing you. They are like helping you care for yourself when you are not able to. And like the supremacist thinking and the racism, the xenophobia is so strong in those minds that it's a wonder that the caregiver doesn't just like, or the professional caregiver in this case, doesn't just quit and leave. And so the space is absolutely needed. And I'm really, really applaud you for that. And I did want to just highlight that little glimpse of what I saw when I barely looked, right? Because I don't think that a lot of listeners would appreciate that need. I also heard you talk about education. And I think, so this hasn't aired yet, but and here I am talking about my grandmother again. But in Goldsboro, we drove around and we said, this is where rich white people live. This is where poor black people live. This is where progressive white people live because they want to be next to black people or what have you. And well, that segregation, that intentional segregation, really does contribute to disparities in education, but not just the kind that you can assess by testing, but also the kind of guidance like, this is Medicare and this is Medicaid, and this is how you navigate these government programs because they are not easy y'all. And I mean, you probably,
No.
you can't see it on here. There's a JD on the wall right over there. And when I try to read the Medicaid law and the Medicare law and try to really traverse those healthcare systems and the explanations that are provided for them, I am lost, like absolutely lost. And so the resources that you are providing are literally essential. Um, and I don't think that I needed to make sure that was lifted up as well. All of that before I get to something you snuck in there, which is the a little bit about Biden, what's in Biden's infrastructure plan, because it sounds like in your day job you do some policy work, and so I'd love just to hear a little bit more about that, so I can nerd out a little bit.
Most definitely. So, around the time that Rachel and I, kind of started to explore some partnership opportunities and
Mm-hmm.
how we could work together. I also became the constituency organizer for Caring Across Generations, and it's a policy advocacy organization that I've actually been involved with since about, I'd say, 2018. I started as a volunteer. Um, and it's kind of interesting how I became involved with the organization. I was at a conference in Florida called Blog Her, and it is the largest conference for women in digital media. I'm also a writer, and I was doing a lot of freelance work at the time.
Do you need to plug?
And
Do you need to plug another website? Because you can do that here.
just blogher.com. I guess I can
Blogher.com.
plug that. But yeah, it was a fantastic conference. One of the things that really shocked me was that on the list of breakout sessions was a conversation about caregiving. I thought that was odd because I was trying to figure out what is the connection between digital media and caregiving. Um, when I sat in on that conversation, I realized that there are these women on stage who represented different races, different ages, but they were all using digital platforms to share their story. And I think that's also really where I got the idea specifically for Our Turn to Care. There were a lot of things that, observations that led up to it, but the idea to form something specific really came from that conference. While I was there was a woman by the name of Jamie Jin, and she was with the organization Caring Across Generations. She approached me after I kind of shared a bit about my personal journey and said that, I should reach out to one of her colleagues, Vanessa Faraj, who, connects with family caregivers, learns their stories, which are then used to kind of support the policies that are put in place, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure that some folks have seen maybe on C-SPAN, but certainly in pre-pandemic times, you would have kind of lobby days, and you'd have folks, if a bill is trying to be passed, folks may give a testimonial as to why, it's important. And so that's a lot of the work that Caring Across Generations does. And over the years, I just kind of have become more and more involved. I participated in their fellowship in 2019, the inaugural fellowship, and completed an internship as the legislative and organizing analyst. And then at the beginning of in the first quarter of this year, I signed on full time as their constituency organizer.
Yeah.
And so I spend all day really talking to other family caregivers about, what resources have been helpful, but also what are the barriers to accessing those resources. And so one of the things that we did as an organization back in March is we conducted a lobby day, or I'm sorry, a week of action. So it was a week of lobbying
Cool.
our elected officials across the country. And we, over Zoom, we just spoke with folks and really made our appeal in asking for support in Biden's decision that had not been made at the time,
Mm-hmm.
but to include care in, within these conversations about infrastructure, specifically $400 billion to be allotted to home and community-based services that I shared about
Yes.
before. And I'm really, really proud of this work. And most recently, we discovered that $400 billion was set aside for care and for home and community-based services, and that is a huge deal. That is a
Oh
huge
yeah.
victory, because it supports the programs that exist, but it also makes room for the programs and services that currently don't exist,
Hmm.
and that people don't yet have access to in some states. So it's a big win, but there's definitely still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, because when we're talking about our turn to care, you saw the need, you developed it, but it was pre-pandemic at least. It was very specific to the Atlanta area. And it's isn't it so frustrating when you see a need that is so big and you're like, okay, I can do this much. I can do this small amount to move the needle by like an inch, even though I know there are miles and miles to go. Um, okay, so we've been going a little bit over 20 minutes because we're talkers. Let's take a quick coffee break and then I want to come back and we've got to talk about the values that led you into becoming this incredible person. I am so interested. We will be right back. Okay, we are back with Aisha Adkins, co executive director of Love Labor Project, founder of Our Turn to Care, which is now a program of Love Labor Project. Ooh, and I wrote it down. What is the name of the organization that you're currently working for that we just talked about?
Yes, caring across generations.
Caring across generations. And then, duh, I'm so bad at this lately. Your Instagram handle or wherever people can follow you.
Yeah, definitely. So you can find me on most of the social meds. I'm at Aisha.Adkins. That's ADKINS on Instagram, and then just Aisha Adkins on Twitter. Uh, yeah,
She
feel free
posts
to
good
reach out.
stuff. I follow her.
Well, thank
So, professionally, and yeah, I would just say exclusively you're a professional caregiver, nonprofit founder, organizer. So, professionally, you've gotten to a really impressive place. In the gay parlance, I'm gagged over all that you're doing. And so
you.
I think the purpose of these podcast episodes is to leave people feeling like inspired and empowered to make a positive change in their own sphere. And you're doing that. And so let's go back, however far you're comfortable with, to talk about the values and events that led you to become the kind of person that sees a problem and then does something about it. Because a lot of people have trouble making that what maybe for us seems like a small jump, because once you do the little that jump, there's a lot more afterwards, right? But just some people that jump seems really big. So what? Tell us about it. Walk us through the journey.
Yeah, no, most definitely. And I should probably share that you mentioned that I'm a professional caregiver, but I'm actually an unpaid just family
Yeah.
caregiver for my parents. Um, and there's definitely a distinction there. Um, but at this point, I feel in some ways like an expert.
Mm.
In that sphere. But to answer your question, kind of what formative, uh, journey brought me here. Um, Initially, I was born through 3 months prematurely. I weighed a pound and a half at birth.
Oh wow.
And so, I had a lot of medical challenges growing up, and I've had over 40 surgeries. And so,
Mm.
I was on the receiving end of care for most of my life. And so I definitely saw that taking place in my household. My father had kind of a freak accident with the pair of sneakers,
Oh.
and he actually ruptured his both of his patella tendons when I was 7. And I really saw our community, our neighborhood, um, come together
Mm.
to really help our family. Everything from coming over to cook meals for us, to bring us groceries. One family took me in for Thanksgiving. My father was hospitalized for some complications with some medication. So I really saw people taking action in that way. Another kind of side effect of my childhood illness is also that I was bullied a lot growing up.
Mm.
That was further complicated by the fact that I was one of three Black children in a predominantly white school. So I
Oh, yeah.
experienced, just severe, I don't know that I care for the term bullying. I call it peer harassment because if the same things that took place, in our school systems took place in the workplace, there would be cause for potentially for, lawsuits and
Yeah.
arrest and all kinds of consequences. But we, at the same time, when we're talking about children, there's this idea that, we say boys will be boys or kids are just, they're just playing around, but their actions still have real and long-term consequences. So I think from an early age, I always knew that I wanted to help people who were suffering
Mm.
and uh, who felt unloved, who felt that they just existed on the edges of society, and that were, really struggling. And so it was always a part of my plan. I initially uh, planned to earn my master's degree in social work. I have an undergraduate degree in social services, sociology with a social services emphasis. Um, but it's interesting because when my mother became ill in 2013, she was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia. I was working in healthcare at the time,
Oh.
and I really thought that, my career path was in healthcare. I figured I would either get my master's in social work, um, or in pediatric social work specifically, and then I discovered something called child life specialty, where you are kind of a liaison between the physician, the family, and the patient, for children who are confronting terminal illness or,
Mm.
major life-changing operations. I saw myself in that space as well, eventually. But interacting with the social worker at the hospital where my mother, or the healthcare system where my mother was receiving treatment, was really a frustrating experience because it felt like the social worker that, he had been assigned to, which may have frankly been the only social worker for what was what's a very large healthcare system. I think possibly the largest one in the state of Georgia, uh, really did not have solid solutions and reasonable resources. We got, she gave us a couple of pamphlets and sort of sent us on our way,
Mm.
and said she'd call us and check in. But I think the kind of assistance that we were looking for, the kind of answers we were looking for, in terms of understanding the disease better, figuring out what supports we would need during the course of this progressive terminal illness, she was not able to provide.
Mm.
And I could tell that it frustrated her, because there was a sense of hopelessness that she exuded,
Mm.
which, obviously for a family in crisis, is not uplifting in any way.
Yeah.
And I just realized that I never wanted to be in a position where I didn't feel like I could make a difference,
Ah.
because either my workload capacity was too high, or I just wasn't provided with the resources that I needed in order to set others up for success,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, um, so I still wanted to help people. And, I explored other possible ways that I could do that. I looked, at the tech startup world, innovations in healthcare technology, and didn't find that that was a good fit, uh, predominantly because of my caregiving responsibilities. I think, employers are really hesitant to hire someone if they know that they're a caregiver, because there
Oh.
are questions around, availability, as a caregiver at any moment. I may have to step aside from a meeting and, be there for my family.
Yeah.
And that's a priority. And, a lot of employers would like to think that employment at their company, their organization is your top priority, and that's just not the case
Yeah.
for me. And I don't think that's the case for most people, but I think that's kind of the wish, particularly in startup communities where you know they can be very engulfing
Hmm.
and really take over. And so I eventually, once I had launched Our Turn to Care, about a year and a half in, I was actually on Facebook, and I saw an ad for the Andrew Young School of Public Studies, and
Oh.
this is a school that was named after the Andrew Young, Ambassador Andrew Young, who was a key figure in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, was an ambassador for the UN, and he's an amazing person I've had the privilege of meeting, but this is his namesake
Yeah.
college within Georgia State University. And they had a program for nonprofit management. And I,
Oh.
as a budding nonprofit leader, thought this sounds like something that I could be into. And upon further exploration, I found out that this program is actually designed with working professionals in mind. The courses took place, after 4 p.m. And when my father was working full time, it worked out for him to be able to leave, about an hour earlier. And, I would basically trade places with him and caring for my mother, and head downtown. And I just was so inspired by my classmates in that program who were constantly encouraging me. I also still involved in a research team through the School of Nursing in partnership with Emory University, called Alter, that actually looks at the impact of faith on African American caregivers of persons with dementia. I definitely could relate to that.
Wow,
My
that's
family,
specific.
yes, very, very specific, very niche. But they're really dedicated to making sure that, older adults and people who've been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia don't lose connection to their faith community, right? And so, and we know oftentimes in the African American tradition, particularly in the South, churches have played a big role in the community, and often are sources and hubs for information about health
Yeah.
and about wellness. And so figuring out how to educate those populations on what dementia is, and what your kind of treatment options are, because there's no cure, but you can manage the symptoms, and making sure that information then gets into the broader communities, that was perfect for me. And so
Yeah.
I really, really had a dream experience for my graduate studies, and I
Yeah.
earned my degree in December 2020. And
Oh,
I feel so
congratulations.
privileged.
I just,
Thank
I just had to
you.
look at the date on the computer. I was like, hey, wait a minute.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, years and days and times all kind of blur together, I think, at this point. But I'm really proud that I was able to accomplish that.
Hmm.
But also, just those experiences, and I think, I was able to specialize. I had an individual concentration in sociology and healthcare. So again, very specific, but being able to design a program that really informed the kind of work that I wanted to do
Yeah.
was really important to me. And here we are.
Okay. Okay. I had to pick up my pencil again. I heard, um, if I were scripting this out in my mind, if it was putting in text, there are a lot of different chapters, but I think each chapter is kind of highlighted or centered around a theme of inspiration in some way. And maybe you were too young. You were a premature baby, so you
Mhm.
really probably weren't inspired in that moment by what was going on. But it sounds like your family really showed up for you, and that healthcare became really important to you at the earliest age, and it's ongoing.
Mhm.
And then your father's, when he had something happen to him involving sneakers, um,
Mhm.
every people just showed up, and that sense of community, I think, is something that maybe inspired you. I know it inspires me like every day,
Mhm.
um, and I mean, I can almost like point a direct, like a direct line. Oh, she was really inspired by community at a young age. Now she's bringing together a community that supports things that she's interested in, or people who need that support, and who might be facing. It's so weird that we talked about this. Who might be facing professional harassment, similar to the harassment that you experienced as a child. And I mean, honestly, it's like things really lined up for you, huh?
Most definitely. Most definitely.
Because often it doesn't make sense how people get to where they are.
Yeah, I know I think it's probably a bit unusual
Yes.
how direct my trajectory was.
Yes.
But I also, believe in, divine providence and I believe in purpose. And so, um, I would like to think that even the most difficult things that I went through, um, you know, really contributed to um, a stronger character than I think maybe I would have had otherwise. That combined with the values that my parents instilled in me, to help those who were in difficult situations, and I saw a lot of that as well.
I think something that's kind of like gathering around me in the ether right now when you're talking about your family, and the values they instilled in you, and your almost like confidence and purpose. You mentioned wanting to join a tech startup, but as a caregiver, feeling as though these employers were not open to that experience. But you knew that you could contribute, and you
Mhm.
knew that you could solve problems, um, and what a loss for those employers, because it is clear just from a simple conversation with you, that any organization you touch is going to go places and is going to do big things. I mean, you're 4 months from having graduated.
Yeah.
This is wild.
It is. And
Yes.
first of all, thank you for the, the vote of confidence. Yeah, I mean, I think, frankly, the pandemic is really shedding a light on what's possible,
Hmm.
um, in, in the workplace. So many people are at home juggling family responsibilities with their work. But we haven't heard of entire industries, you know, collapsing
Yeah.
because people are working remotely, and so and because people are more flexible with their hours, or and working at kind of odd hours, or because a child comes into the room, with a diaper on the head or something,
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
we and I think people are starting to realize that it's okay to include, um, or to consider people's family situations in making sure that they're set up for success in the workplace,
Yeah.
and not to make assumptions about um, qualifications of a potential employee based on the status of their family. And I think that so I think I'm encouraged. I think that a lot of companies and organizations that were maybe resistant to not only remote work, but implementing things like paid family leave, and those kinds of workplace policies, I think are really kind of turning the corner on some of these things, because they're realizing that it may not be easy at first to make some of these changes and to implement them, seamlessly,
Hmm.
but it's definitely worth it. And it really can improve, the quality of work for everyone.
100% agree. 100% agree. Um, so let's get into what our turn to care is going to look like. So we know what it is. We've got a sense of the values that inspired it. And so we know it's a good organization that's doing good things, right? But let's talk about what those things that it's doing look like. So can you, we've touched a little bit on who it supports as our turn to care. Is that going to change now that it is a program of Love Labor Project?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, what we plan to offer coming forward, the things that are in the works include BIPOC centric support groups that will run in addition to the support groups that Love Labor Project
Mm-hmm.
offers currently, creating a safer space for BIPOC folks and for those of your listeners who may not be familiar, BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color.
Oh, they ought to know by now.
Okay,
They
you've
better
educated the
know.
masses. You've educated the masses. Great. And so yeah, we really felt that um, because caregivers can have such intersectional identities, there are some experiences that folks just may feel more comfortable sharing in uh, in a space with folks who they feel like could relate to them, right?
Oh yeah.
Um,
I mean, we don't
so
have to. We don't have to be like too sweet about it or anything, but
sometimes, yeah, sometimes, I'll say this. I'll say that sometimes, it can be challenging to be in spaces where you're sharing really intimate details um, with, white folks who, even if they're well-meaning,
right.
may not understand
The phrase "well
or
meaning"
could.
was the next one on my lips. Like they mean
Yep.
well, but they don't
Yes.
know.
Exactly. Or frankly, someone could show up one day that doesn't mean well,
Mm,
that really has
yeah,
like some deep-seated issues that they need to see someone about.
yeah.
Um, but to pretend that racism doesn't have an impact um, on the caregiving experience, would be, yeah, I mean, I don't even have
Harmful. I
words
was
for
gonna
that.
say naive, but harmful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Both, I think those are both great words to describe it. And so, really giving people space to say, look, this is, I took my, father to a doctor's appointment and we experienced, racial bias from the physician.
Hmm.
Or, I'll give an example from my own life, just, um, you know, uh, making sure that my mother is presentable. It may be something about hair care,
Oh yeah.
that I know that my white counterparts just aren't going to understand, and their inability to understand doesn't make them bad people, but it can be triggering and
Yeah.
it can be upsetting and it can be frustrating. But being in a space where others are more likely to be able to understand exactly what you're going through, and what the concern is about the hair care, like the history of Black women's hair,
Hmm.
and the implications, and like what all of that means, and why it's important for me to make sure that she's taken care of in that particular way. And because it has to do with like the way that we present ourselves in the world, and it goes so much deeper than just a task to be completed, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, creating those safer spaces to have those conversations, I think makes a huge difference. And there aren't many things available like that right now. So, in addition to those support groups that will be launching soon, um, we also are going to have uh, BIPOC specific programming, things that are trauma informed, because we know that there is racial, gender, and generational trauma that exists within communities of color, and that can impact the way that you provide care for your loved one. And I even hesitate sometimes to use the term loved one, because there's also this assumption about the type of relationship that you have with a parent.
Hmm.
And so just acknowledging that there are different types of relationships that you can have with someone that you're caring for. And that can be impacted by a lot of external forces that have existed for hundreds of years. So, making sure that we have programming available through that lens. We will have programming around healing those wounds as well,
Mhm.
and how to live and exist in that space is really important. So, yeah, just we really are looking forward to expanding um, the resources. One of my favorite personal resources is therapy for Black girls. Is a great resource. That's how I've been able to research therapists that I
Hmm.
know will have the cultural competency and cultural understanding that I need, and and really talking about like what is therapy, for folks who may not be familiar, who've
Yeah.
never had that experience, and who may be hesitant. So a lot of these things, are in the works, but I'm really excited to really expand these opportunities and to create these spaces.
That sounds really exciting. One thing I want to go back to it. You wouldn't have had the opportunity to hear this. Again, I've recorded too many episodes at one time, and so I'd mentioned that there were some things on the camera earlier that I had to transfer to my computer, and one of them is an episode directly related to anti-racism, and so there's so much tied into hair, in particular, and we won't dive into that because that can literally be its own episode. But for listeners who might not understand, particularly if you're white, your great grandfather taught your grandfather, who is still practicing medicine, that Black women or women of color with particular types of hair, in short, deserve less care or worse treatment than Black people, Black women in particular, who have a particular type of hair that generally just looks more like white hair.
Mhm.
That's what that's about. Okay. And that was weighing on me. I was like, if I don't let people know, then they'll never learn.
No, thank you. And I appreciate you breaking that down. And that's something that is real. And I think as we have these conversations about anti-racism
Mhm.
and really defining what that looks like, I think people will be shocked to realize that it's so pervasive,
Yeah.
and that it really infiltrates every fiber of our being, individually and as a nation with, you know, when you look at the way that Black women have provided care for this country, it started out with slavery,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
taking care of the offspring of the slave holders. And so, and then you fast forward to, the indentured servants and the paid care workers. And there's a long legacy of not, of not, first of all, not paying not
Yep.
paying
Yep.
us at all, and then paying us uh menially. And so that's another thing that carrying across generations actually co-advocates for alongside our sister organization, the National Domestic Workers Alliance.
Oh.
It's for fair wages for folks who are paid to do this work, and making sure that their working environments are dignified. And you mentioned the vitriol and the cruelty that these folks can often face in providing care for folks who, if I'm a white person who grew up in the Jim Crow South, and
Mhm.
the only understanding or context I have for Black people is that they are less than and that they are subhuman in some way.
Yeah.
And now this person is uh, interacting with me on a very intimate level.
Yeah.
Uh, there's no context for respect. There's no evolution of understanding and values. And so, you know, I think that people, my hope is that people will really take a look at their biases as they exist, and also figure out ways to be actively anti-racist against and against anti-Blackness in their own lives, and in their interactions that they have with people who are providing care. But my hope is also um, to help the Black community heal,
Yeah.
to help communities of color really begin to, yeah, I hate to say embrace, I hesitate to say that, because I feel like that would say that, folks aren't out here, loving everything about being Black. But I think there's also, within Black communities, there's also a lot of, kind of self-hatred that can exist as well, that
Mm.
also impacts the way that we are comfortable showing up, and the way that and there's this fear sometimes associated with the way that we're going to be perceived. There's sometimes a fear of advocating for yourself. My mother had to have 4 different diagnoses before she experienced 4 misdiagnoses before we
Oh.
finally got to the correct diagnosis. Um, had I decided that I was not qualified enough, that I was not intelligent enough,
Hmm.
um, that I was not worthy enough, and that my mother wasn't worthy enough of getting the care that she absolutely needed, because a white man in a white coat told me something,
Yeah.
and that should be gospel. I think we would have been in a very, very bad off situation,
Yeah.
right? And it would have been, I think the journey would have been much different. But again, because my parents instilled that confidence in me, and never never allowed me uh, to be suppressed
Hmm.
within the home.
Hmm.
I think that really allowed me to step up in a way that I probably wouldn't have otherwise. And so that's another thing that I want to do with Our Turn to Care is, remind people of the power that they have,
Yeah.
um, and the worth that they carry, even in situations that can seem intimidating, if you're working across class and racial lines.
Well, I am so happy that you and Rachel have teamed up for this because I know from that previous episode that Love Labor Project is international in scope. And
Mhm.
so you'll be able to help build confidence and support so many more people who really need it. And it sounds like it might not even just be support for their caregiver and kind of a general, like, oh, you need a place to vent or share what kind of heavy way. But they sound like confidence building exercises, like tactical resources. And that's kind of the benefit of having an organizer at the helm, I think. So I'm really, really thrilled for all that you're going to bring to the world, I guess, is fair to say.
I'm excited too. I
Yeah.
really am.
Well, let's take uh, I always say a short coffee break right now. We'll take a coffee break and it'll last as long as it lasts. And then we'll be right back. We are back with Aisha Adkins. This was not the fastest coffee break. We took our time, but
We did.
I'm really loving this conversation that we're having, and I'm just sorrowful that we have to bring it to a close. But there's still some questions that that I want answers to. Dang
All right,
it.
let's go.
So
Bring it on.
when Rachel came on, she had this phrase that she hated. I think hate is probably the appropriate word. Let me know if you need anything. Let me know if you need anything, I think is what she does in the
Yeah,
clip.
yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
Accurate.
And so I was wondering if, as a one of the several takeaways that I'm asking you for, if there is a similar phrase or something that's well-meaning. Again, that phrase well-meaning, but it's actually maybe a little triggering.
Yeah, I would say for me, there are a couple. I think the main one is probably, you know, God's going to bless you for this.
Hmm.
And this comes from, a lot of like older family members. I'm a person of faith. I practice Christianity. But I have a problem with kind of that analysis because it implies that like, you know, you're going to suffer for many, many years. And then one day,
Mm.
like, I don't know, I'm going to die. It'll be okay. I don't know kind of where I understand what people mean. I understand that, I'm doing something that many people view as honorable.
Yeah.
However, it doesn't change. It doesn't, there are two things it doesn't change. It doesn't change that caregiving is really hard.
Yep.
It is really, really mentally and physically exhausting.
Yeah.
It just is, right? Uh, the other thing that it doesn't change is that, my mother is dying.
Yeah.
And that's something that, I don't think people understand is that this is something I'm bearing witness to. Not to be like overly emotional, but this is something I'm bearing witness to every single day.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make sense. My mother has always been a good person and always very eager to help people. And so witnessing that every day, um, and 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 thinking somehow I'll be rewarded for that,
Mm.
kind of just watching that every day, is it's difficult.
Yeah.
And I've definitely had questions. When I say my prayers, I have questions about purpose sometimes, and why good people suffer,
Mm.
and seemingly you know uh, I won't say bad people because I don't know that I believe fully in that, but people who do terrible things sometimes are rewarded.
Yeah.
It's challenging to reconcile that. So when people kind of you know just inform me that I should keep doing what I'm doing, um, and that someday it'll be okay, when there's really no end in sight, is frustrating. Uh, you know, I I think what would be more helpful
Mm.
is, maybe telling me that, we understand that this is difficult for you. Um,
Yes.
we believe that, having faith means that you have faith in the people that, God has put in your life, that like, people who can support you, and being grateful for that, being grateful for very specific things. And I think sometimes that can be more grounding and less ethereal.
Yeah.
And I think that provides more like immediate hope for me.
Well, you are such a great podcast guest because you're already answering the questions before I even ask them.
Sorry.
You're like, here is what I don't like, and here is what you can do instead. I'm like, oh, okay. Wonderful. What I'm hearing in what you don't like about that phrase is that it really doesn't show genuine empathy. Um, with the solutions that you've offered as alternatives, um, you let the person know that you actually see them, that you genuinely think about that they are going through something really, really hard, and that calling out specific things lets you know that you are being seen, rather than just something kind of generic that someone can toss out, from across the church parking lot.
Exactly. Bingo.
Oh, good. Oh, bingo. Yes.
To borrow a phrase from my father, I think we're kind of all morphing into one person at this point.
I like that. So, okay, now I was gonna follow up with something to take that the audience can take away from the conversation that you want to make sure that they take back in their lives, and you've given us a whole lot. I'm gonna have to like keep inviting you back because I feel like every time you come back, there's gonna be something new and wonderful that you're doing.
I
Um,
love that.
but do you happen to have something or a point that you want to make sure that the audience takes away?
Yeah, I think, and I alluded to this before, but if you are a caregiver, a millennial caregiver, um, if you have these like intersecting identities, know your worth, know that you are
Mm,
worth the time, you're worth the resources, you're not an imposition, you're not in the way. And that there are spaces like ours where you can be seen and heard. And we have to keep fighting, we have to keep telling our stories. um, and even though there may be an expectation, that seems like an unfair burden that's put on you, um, there are places that can support you. And so
mhm.
it's it can be overwhelming and it can be exhausting, but definitely dig in, find those resources locally, tell people in your life exactly what you need, and you might be surprised at how they show up for you.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, and wow, we hadn't even really gotten to that in the rest of what we were talking about. So I'm glad that we saved space for that. Um, Aisha, this has been an incredible conversation. On behalf of the Bottomless Coffee community, I'm going to go ahead and express profound gratitude for you taking the time to speak with me and to us today. Please tell me, how can we support you in your work?
Definitely. Number one is funding. I know people don't like to hear that, but if
No,
you're
this is
looking,
a safe space for funding.
okay, perfect. So if you're looking for a place to support um, anti-racist work that's going on, I know that Rachel is committed to that, and that's the only reason that I'm working with her, is because of her profound commitment to doing that work. Please consider donating to Love Labor Project. You can go to lovelaborproject.org, click the donate button. uh, you know we want to expand these programs, but oftentimes they do take money because we want to
Mhm.
reach out to folks in BIPOC communities, but we want to be able to compensate them for their time as well. So we would love if you would make a donation.
Yeah, I don't think Rachel even suggested that we donate to Love Labor Project. She's been on here twice.
See, that's why it takes two.
It
That's
takes
why
two.
that's why it takes two.
It does take money, y'all. This is work. It is hard work. It is beneficial for everybody. If you can donate to Love Labor Project, please do. I'm going to. I can't believe I haven't done it before. So,
Thank you. We appreciate that, Jerome.
absolutely. Thank you so much. One last time, where would you like? Where can we follow you? Where can we connect?
Yeah, no, connect with me. You can connect with me on my website, aishaadkins.com, and you'll find the links there to all of my social media, most active on Instagram. So certainly don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much, Aisha.
Thank you, Dre.
Bye bye. Yay!